Osionigata. My name is Jeff Corntassel. Welcome to another episode of Frontlines Are Everywhere, the podcast that looks at Indigenous internationalism and expressions of self-determining authority across Turtle Island and beyond. Today, we're so excited to have Kolin Sutherland-Wilson from Gitxsan on with us. And I wanted just to note that we had some technical difficulties in our first taping of this. So we've re-recorded some of the parts, and we wanted to maintain Colin's introduction and keep it intact. So there's a little bit of rough audio at the first minute or so, and then after that it clears up. So thank you for bearing with us. And welcome, Kolin. I'm just going to read your bio really quickly. Colin's a Gitxsan land defender and artist from the house known as Gogiit, the Fireweed Clan, hailing from the village of Anspayaxw. Kolin is currently chief of Anspayaxw band, as well as a proud parent and self-proclaimed troublemaker. Welcome, Kolin, and would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
For sure. Thank you so much, Jeff. So, my name is Hoki, which means one more in the Gitxsan language, and that comes from the house of Tibasa, which is our head chief, but it's also known as the house of Ganohalidoh. I come from the village of Anspayaxw, which is... You'll find it on the map under Anspayaxw, how Anspayaxw became Anspayaxw. Don't ask me, we don't even know. And for the most part, I've been engaged in land defense for the past 5 years and, just tried my best to support our Wet'suwet'en relatives, the coastal gasling fight. And, now I've spent a lot of time kind of in my many capacities dealing with the PRGT front. And, overall, I think there's a lot to get into there, but, whether it's in the courts or whether it's on the land, I'm all for it, just upholding our rights and fighting the fight.
Excellent. What for that. And coming to us from Hawaii today, so where it's a little sunnier than up north. So good to see you. I usually start off by asking this question. It's kind of related to, what is Indigenous internationalism? And so, we think of Indigenous nations across Turtle Island and even beyond have extensive trade networks, treaties, amongst other nations, diplomacies, activism beyond state borders, and even travel to other Indigenous nations like Hawaii. What does this concept of Indigenous internationalism, does it resonate for one thing, but does it have a meaning for you or a particular sense of a meaning?
Colonialism is an international project. It's an international strategy. And I think, no matter where you go in this world, you'll find the exact same trends, the exact same tactics, and the exact same goals, which is for colonial states to exercise their authority and jurisdiction over Indigenous lands. And, like we just spent the other day up visiting Mauna Kea and hearing all about, the struggle that's been happening there from Antipuakes and, even just looking at the state of that project and how, it very much, there's just so many parallels to what we're dealing with PRGT. Now, there's people all over the world who are tackling the exact same issues as you. And there's also a great willingness to jump in and support each other, especially when, it all boils down to those fundamental values that, we all seem to hold in common. And that's really just a respect for life itself and, just a veneration of those basic rights that should be afforded to all living things, not just humans. That includes, clean air, clean water, sunshine, warmth, care, love, community. And there's a lot more people than we tend to think who are out there fighting for all that, and and we're all going up against the same players. So I think Indigenous internationalism, it's going to be key. It's going to be key to this fight going forward, and it definitely helps me to not get pigeonholed in my own Gitxsan struggle at home.
Yeah, yeah, would owe for that. And you were able to go to the base of Mauna Kea and talk with folks about some of the struggles there around of course, they've been staving off this 30-meter telescope, which was supposed to be basically a 20-story structure right on top of this sacred mountain, and they've held it off for years now. What are some of the sense of struggle that you're seeing there, or maybe even frustration around this almost adamance about we must build this telescope on top of this sacred mountain?
Like the fight has moved through numerous different stages, all the way from the mass mobilizations and, the antis leading the charge to, now it's kind of locked up in this, essentially there's a different language they use around it over here, but it's the same as the substantial start, because all the permits, are either expiring or have expired. I think the financiers for this telescope, they're already looking at alternatives all around the world. Who do you want to fund like a telescope that's already being built down in South America, or do you want to fund a telescope that hasn't even broken ground? But it still seems like people are trying to push to salvage this project behind the scenes and, essentially say that, these permits shouldn't expire because we've had meetings about it and, done a few desktop exercises. But I think at the end of the day, I would say that the resistance has been, extraordinarily successful on all fronts. And, the people who've been putting in the work here, whether that's, from day one, fighting the permits for this telescope to, all the people who've come together to occupy the space at the base of Mauna Kea, or, even just the stories that I've heard of the resurgence of, Hawaiian spirituality, which, was a beautiful, beautiful thing to hear about, and just the reverence for that space and Mauna Kea and what it means, and that, that connection point between all these different realms within the cosmology. It's, I think, there's so many victories that you can pinpoint. And so right now, I think, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibilities from what I've heard that, there might be some, as we say back home, some greasy procedure that, might extend the permits for this telescope. But I think, the resistance is very strong and very inspiring. And, and I just have to put my hands up, like, especially to Antipua Case for sitting down with us and, sharing so much of the story and sharing advice, and that building of that international solidarity. And, I think for sure they can count on, the myself and many Gitxsan to be, a part of supporting them, because, at least now, like I've heard the story, I've understood it, I've been there on that sacred ground, I've stood there on that lava flow.
Absolutely, one of the highest mountains in the world, actually, if you measure from the base, and one of the largest mobilizations for generations in Hawaiian history. So I think I'm so glad you've been able to experience that and also take those lessons away from Kanaka Maoli struggles. Well, you talked about the proposed Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline, PRGT, and how it's been problematic. And I was wondering if you could just kind of fill in the kind of general audience about why it's been so problematic. And as I understand, it was originally negotiated in 2014. They should have, when they kind of reproposed it, should have applied for new permits and new kinds of permissions, and they haven't, right? And so So I was wondering if you could fill us in on some of the struggles there. And, it's interesting, the parallels, right, from Hawaii to Gitxsan territory.
Yeah, well, PRGT, I'd say it's the textbook case of greasy procedure. So, like you mentioned, 2014 was a big year for gas pipelines. I think this was kind of getting into the whole Christy Clark mania of energy transition and, really building up the BC infrastructure to basically capitalize on the gas reserves that are found in the Northeast. So we saw what happened with the Wet'suwet'en, where, TC Energy originally tried to approach the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who, as we all know, have a very strong legal standing when it comes to the title, the unceded title when it comes to the wider territories. And, that was proven in the Supreme Court of Canada, through numerous legal proceedings. That was also, evident in the years of ongoing treaty negotiations where the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were the sole representative of the Wet'suwet'en people in these tripartite negotiations with the province of British Columbia and Canada. And but I think one thing we quickly learned is that, whereas in the past that, Canada or the Crown, would have used a strategy of, complete denial of any and all, Indigenous rights, Indigenous title in order to push these projects through. We found that the strategy is adapted since the Delgamuukw era to essentially find and facilitate um, agreements with people who will essentially accept the money that's being offered. And so, I mean, that became a challenge when we saw what was happening with the Wet'suwet'en band councils, who, historically and in my entire lifetime have never had jurisdiction beyond the reserve boundaries. And now, you had these councils, which, without referendums, without, any democratic process, were signing agreements with both the province, which, those agreements are on public record, but also with TC Energy, which, these agreements still have never come to the light of day. They're locked behind non-disclosure agreements. And, which I think is highly problematic because, just take, for example, say you live in any municipality in the world or any type of jurisdiction of a local government. Um, would you want your mayor and village council signing agreements, that are completely removed from the immediate community, and that also include direct kickbacks to the councilors involved? I think, for some reason, it just still eludes me to this day how, this could be a legal process within a so-called democratic nation, or a democratic state of Canada. Like all this rhetoric that was getting pumped out about how it's, the democratically elected band council chiefs who at the end of the day should have say over the wider territories as opposed to the hereditary chiefs, which is a gross simplification of everything that's been happening. But that's, to me, I just don't understand how that could still be argued, when we see this complete lack of transparent procedure. But anyway, getting back to PRGT. So as this was all happening in Wet'suwet'en territories, the same players, these same parties went up to the Gitxsan territories and they did sign an agreement with about 10 Gitxsan hereditary chiefs, and that's 10 out of over 60 hereditary houses in total. And it was the exact same procedures, NDAs, non-disclosure to the community members, kind of lack of WILP meetings, WILP consent. And then interestingly enough, while they were elevating band councils as the rightful signatories and decision makers on the wider territories and Wet'suwet'en territories, they didn't even bother to make any agreements with the Gitxsan band councils immediately next door with the exact same type of pipeline. Going through territories which pretty much have the exact same legal standing because the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en were uh, co-plaintiffs in the Delgamuukw court case. And so, all those precedents that were set in the Supreme Court of Canada apply equally to both our parties, and we share the same hereditary and territorial management system. And so we saw essentially that, for Canada, and I think especially for the province, and this is a question I'll always ask the provincial officials, is that, why is it that your process in, determining who is the legitimate authority on Indigenous land tends to be, whoever will accept the money? How can you have these two completely contrasting cases, like immediately right beside each other, with what is almost a carbon copy of the exact same pipeline project? So that, right off the bat, I think set up a lot of red flags for a lot of us Gitxsan, especially the younger generations who were and still, will go out to support our Wet'suwet'en relatives on the Yinta. And, that's, I think in the past 5 years, like it's been nonstop pipeline battles, and that's not only just the one on our homeland, PRGT. And I think we'll get a little more into, why PRGT wasn't even emphasized for the longest time. And that's because we all thought it was dead. But
Yeah.
we've been committed to fighting Coastal GasLink with our relatives down there. And so PRGT, it, like fundamentally there's those issues. And then, we also have, I think, issues of, what does it mean to consent at the level of a WILP, which, is a big conversation that's happening right now within Gitxsan territory, and especially amongst the youth. There's been community meetings and a whole lot going on there. But so for PRGT, we saw what happened with Coastal GasLink. They basically put all their chips in there. They started to, move with the kind of on the ground surveying work. That all got blocked by the Unistoten, and then you saw more of the Wet'suwet'en clans get involved. But then, you started to see these injunctions coming, and then you started to see the arbitrary execution of these injunctions, which started to include all these things like exclusion zones and, paramilitarized police forces and, like a whole lot of stuff that had very little precedent in British Columbia before, like this. I mean, there's many cases of the use of, military and, a forceful dispersion of Indigenous resistance. But I think we really started to see the newer playbook that was being implemented, and a playbook that was being led by, people within the RCMP who, really cut their teeth out in the Middle East serving with NATO. And we started to see this new command structure emerge that is very much, built upon these quick response military tactics. And so we saw the implementation of the Community Industries Response Group, CIRG, which I think has now become CREW, which I believe is the Critical Response Unit. And then they have BC after that in the acronym. But, we started to see the playbook with the injunctions, with the enforcement, and, with the mass arrests. We saw Shut Down Canada. We saw a whole lot happening on the Coastal GasLink front. Meanwhile, with Prince Rupert Gas Transmission, where they wanted to put that terminal in Prince Rupert, specifically on Lelu Island or La Hula, that all got canned in 2017. Like there was pretty significant opposition to that. Within Simsan, you had Yahan and the Gitwalgyots. They permanently occupied La Hula. They, essentially, there was a huge movement across the board on the entirety of the Skeena River to protect the native eelgrass species there that were critical for the transition of all of our salmon species, as they moved from their juvenile stage out into the ocean and did that transition to the saltwater. But there was also Maddie Lee. There was, several other points of resistance to PRGT, and I think many of them were an extension of previous pipeline fights and also the Northern Gateway affair. And so 2017, PRGT, that terminal location was scrapped. And I believe it was Petronas out of Malaysia. That was one of the key players in building these terminals and financing this project, and they just completely gave up on PRGT. So PRGT essentially became a dead-end pipeline with nowhere to go. And so we didn't see any work on it. We didn't see any of those preliminary surveys or assessments that, we saw leading up to the big conflict on Coastal GasLink, just that years of groundwork. And then basically out of the blue and essentially late last summer and last fall, we got word that, this pipeline was still straggling along. And, it had been receiving these extensions, I guess, from British Columbia, well beyond its original expiration date. And then what I assume is like a Hail Mary move. TC Energy actually handed off this project to the Nisga'a government. And that came as a surprise to a lot of us. And, I think the details of that deal aren't necessarily public. And so there's, a lot I could speculate on, but I also don't want to get in trouble given, my ongoing positioning in the judicial review case that's been initiated against the BC Energy Regulator on allowing this pipeline to start construction. But, the Nisga'a government received this project. It went out of TC Energy's hands, and then they partnered up, Nisga'a with this small outfit out of Houston, Texas, which had never built a pipeline before, very new, very fresh, and that's Western LNG. And yeah, and then they started a last minute scramble to basically start construction on this pipeline, which still had no end terminal. And so in the meantime, they've proposed a floating terminal that would be on Pierce Island, which is north of the Nisga'a community of Gingolich. But that terminal, even as it stands today, it doesn't have an environmental assessment certificate. So at this point, the pipeline still goes nowhere. And then, we saw basically BC make all these concessions to allow them to start construction on this pipeline, which was expiring within a matter of months. So this is all very last minute, nothing like Coastal GasLink, where we saw years of and years of work to them trying to concretize those permits. But so in this case, we had a pipeline that was expiring, and I believe that was November 25th. That was their environmental assessment certificate, which had already received the maximum number of extensions. And then for their construction and which they would need to secure a substantial start, which would then make all these permits last indefinitely, they essentially needed a terminal. They needed a final investment decision. They needed cumulative impacts assessments along the entirety of the right-of-way. And, these were all criteria that they simply did not have. And yet all these criteria were removed from these permits that were being granted to them by the BC Energy Regulator. And now we're going to have to see, probably in a matter of months, whether the Environmental Assessment Office accepts, their application for a substantial start, which, to us, like we've seen, they've barely clear cut a fraction of the entirety of the right of way, this project. And, they still have not even gone outside of the Nisga'a treaty lands. And there's huge opposition from the Gitxsan right at their immediate border, which has completely stunted them in proceeding along that direction. And there's also very significant opposition in the Gitxsan territories, including one entire house immediately on the right of way that has never consented and completely opposes, as well as the house members of numerous houses, even houses that were originally signatories, who have been putting up essentially blockade infrastructure along the right of way. And then we also have Maddie Lee, which has been there since way back in the day, and that is essentially blocking off a very critical part of where they want to put this pipeline. So, we'll see. We'll see. I think it's a fight that's just unfolding on numerous fronts. But when it comes to the precedents we've seen so far, I would not be surprised if they grant the substantial start application, or if they allow those permits to extend indefinitely, because that just seems to be how BC operates. And so, everyone's preparing on the ground for that eventuality. And, I think we could very well see, the next iteration of that, that very same conflict we saw with the Wet'suwet'en and Coastal GasLink.
This is amazing. Thank you for sharing that and giving some of the folks listening, some context for this, because it's been scarcely in the news, and then of course a lot of misinformation. So this is really, really important information to share with folks, and also to clear up some of the notions of what's going on there. So thank you for that. I'll kind of backtrack a little bit, and I'm thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking, at one point the late John Horgan said the rule of law must apply, and he was talking about Wet'suwet'en. And I'm thinking the rule of law doesn't seem to apply to pipelines, to permits, and all of these forms of construction. They seem to defy, any kind of reasoning and logic other than the logic of money and extractive capital. And so I was thinking, this is kind of a setup question, but the United Nations, Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was seen as this amazing possibility, and I think it still has some possibilities. But and then it was invoked as legislation in 2019 in British Columbia as DRIPA, and this idea is that this will change the rule of law. This will, in a sense, center Indigenous interests, especially around free, prior, and informed consent, which clearly hasn't happened in not only CGL but PRGT. And so, again, it's kind of a setup question, but have you seen any difference since that legislation was put into place? Has it shifted anything on the ground in terms of even discussion or discourse, or has it been business as usual?
Well, I have to say, when DRIPA first came to the floor there, I was definitely optimistic, thinking that, if this had any legal bearing, this could totally change the outcome of, so many of these ongoing court cases that we had seen leading up to that point, that, there would be a higher standard for consent. There would be, the development of a process that would, I think in the long run really benefit, all parties in the equation, where you have free, prior, and informed consent. And it might take longer to get the outcome you want, but I think it's a good first step. So that was the optimist. But then, over the years, you just see all these court cases, and in my opinion, something I've learned is that the politicians can say one thing, But if you really want to understand their intentions, you have to listen to what their lawyers are saying in the courts. And, and I think, I wasn't the only one who was thinking that, DRIPA might have some applications within the court of law. And you had, all these different cases happening. And I think specifically, one of the cases I was following, I believe was the the Yahe case, and all these cases relating to I think it was northeastern BC, and just all the damage that had been accumulated over their homelands just over the years of essentially a lot of this gas infrastructure, the extraction, the industries that have been running rampant with this loosey-goosey permitting process that BC has been overseeing. But in that case, and I think in all the other cases you saw in that whole era, you had the lawyers basically, when being confronted with UNDRIP and just this notion of free, prior, and informed consent, their answer was unanimous, and it was, UNDRIP is aspirational. It's aspirational. It doesn't necessarily apply as law itself, but it's something that we're working towards. And so immediately, after the implementation of this in Canadian law, in BC law, we saw it defanged. So it looked good for the papers, but at the end of the day, it meant absolutely squat when it came to the ongoing struggles of all the different nations who were, dealing with situations where, UNDRIP could have been a real game changer. So that was my experience.
Yeah, and we'll see what the federal law, Bill C-15, which is also a form of DRIPA. We'll see what that unveils. But yeah, it's not cause for a lot of optimism, especially as it's been perceived and also implemented or not implemented in BC. Yeah, what for that. I'm taking you back a little bit in time to 2020. And you've already referred to this, but thinking about the invasion of Wet'suwet'en lands by RCMP and other special forces, at Wet'suwet'en as well as Gitxsan. And there was a call for a week of solidarity, I remember, in early 2020. And you basically initiated a solo week-long strike outside the BC legislature in support of Wet'suwet'en peoples and against the CGL pipeline. And I remember you were a student at UVic at the time, and I remember even having conversations with you about what a struggle this was of how do you do land defense while you're in a classroom, right? And I think you were in a couple of my classes. We had some amazing conversations around this. And at some point, people began to join you in this act of solidarity. And my question is, did you think at the time that anyone would join you, as you were, basically a lone voice on the steps of the legislature? Did you think anyone would join that struggle? And also, what did this kind of teach you about land struggles today, or what did this do to kind of maybe light a spark or kind of inspire you to feature land-based actions?
Yeah, now that takes me back, and that's essentially that all the legislature stuff, everything that happened in Victoria, that's just led to a whirlwind for the past 5 years. And it's really interesting just to reflect on it all. And at some point I'm hoping to be, that we'll get some victories and be done with these pipelines, and I can take a break. And but in the meantime, so just getting back to Victoria, yeah, I was a student at UVic. I never was necessarily how would I put it? Like public speaker, or even, that type of person to to really just get out there and, make some noise. Like anyone who's known me my entire life, I've always been the very quiet, nerdy type who, just enjoys things like building computers and playing games on them. And so but, I did grow up with a very fundamentally, I'd say, just solid value system that was based in Gitxsan hereditary law. And, that came a lot from my father, we Mughals. He's one of the hereditary chiefs in our village from the Wolf clan. And then also from my grandfather. That would be Tsibasa, Stanley Wilson. And, he was also the hereditary chief of my house that I currently am a part of. And, so over the years, like I've seen the fight from, going way back to even, when I was born in 93, my dad wasn't around because he was at the BC Court of Appeals, during the Dalgamuk case. And then, growing up, being surrounded by the art that my dad produced, which, depicted all the different fights during that era where they were fighting in the courts, fighting on the land, fighting at the fishing holes, fighting DFO, fighting forestry. And, there'd be big pictures on the walls of the house of, people with big signs saying, Gitxsan jurisdiction or our land's not for sale. And then also hearing about, all these different meetings that were happening in the village back in the 70s and 80s. And, when all the elders would come together and plot for the court case and fight it and, come up with the legal strategies and, just these quotes from that era where it was not 1 inch of our land is for sale. And so, that was the context I came into all of it with, even though I wasn't necessarily, I would say, super dialed into activism or the movement. That was just the baseline understanding. And so for me, I think what really kicked off just, basically abandoning all my schoolwork and heading down to the legislature was, one, the call to action, but two, just the complete lack of, how would I put it? Like it was, or just the misinformation that I was seeing in all the papers coming out of the province, coming out of industry, all this rhetoric around, how like, all this issue is just the Wet'suwet'en people's fault because they can't seem to get their, ducks in a row and they don't know who's the leader and this or that, or it's all internal conflict, nothing to do with any of us. And that just bugged the hell out of me because I've seen and heard about, the iterations of this specific struggle, especially on Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en land, my entire life. And, so that led to me, writing numerous articles for the Martlet, just kind of diving into these issues that led to just me learning how to video edit, producing a little documentary, just trying to tackle and just share the context on this fight because it was just getting simplified at every front and just being made into, some domestic Wet'suwet'en squabble, which I knew was far from the case when you look at these very powerful players involved and their interests on Wet'suwet'en land. And so then, basically I had 1 semester left in my degree, which would have been a double major in Indigenous studies and environmental studies. And I decided I couldn't sit still. Like there's just too much going on up in my head. I especially if I knew something, I had to get out there and at least share what I knew. That was my underlying logic. And being from that part of the world and then coming down here to where it's what really felt like what was the strategic focal point of the Crown in British Columbia. And so I went to the steps, really had no game plan, no expectations. I figured I just had to do something. Like that was the feeling that was tearing me up on the inside. Like I couldn't just live life normally and, go to class and have my lunch and, you know, do my extracurricular activities. Like all that just flew right out the window. And, you know, but I never felt lonely in that regard. Even, those first couple days, I'd be there and there would be, some cousins coming out who are working in the different departments and, like, oh, it's kind of raining, like here's some rain pants. And, even like within all the different fronts, like, there'd be just people coming out of the woodworks. Like, like I really support the Wet'suwet'en and at least in the meantime, you're just this dude who's a constant visual reminder. So like, let's just support this guy. And then at the same time, like there's a huge I would say just a culture of resistance that I've seen in Victoria and in that area. And, especially you have so many of the local native people, but also a lot of the allies. And and what I described is almost like a bubble within British Columbia. Whereas, in other places, I might go and try to have these conversations. People I'd be like, oh, you're just trying to get rid of our jobs and, kind of shit disturber or this or that. Like you'll have these very different types of reactions. But I found in Victoria, it was strange that there was a lot of young people that were just willing to listen and they seemed to have, a bit more of an openness to these perspectives that were coming from, this remote corner of northern British Columbia. And so, we had stuff that was just starting to pop up all of a sudden, like, BC ferries getting blockaded. You had all those bridges being blockaded. You had the occupation that was starting, led by the Indigenous Youth for Wet'suwet'en, which was just like a body of, young people from all the different tribes across the board that, took place in the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Natural Resources. And then, I started getting pulled into all these circles just by, being the guy who was on the steps. And and then like eventually that began to escalate because, when you had all this stuff happening, then you had the media component come into play. And then, I just was the guy who was writing articles and making little documentaries and trying to educate people on some of the nuances. And then they decided, all right, you're going to handle CBC or C-SPAN radio or whatever when they call. And so then I, in a very, what to me felt very strange, I became a spokesperson. And so then all of a sudden I'm debating people on the radio about the Delgamuukw court case. And, I'm debating people on, hereditary versus, band council and, all these different issues. And then that just, then, for me, like not once have I felt like I initiated or started anything at the legislature, but I feel like, I feel more like, the guy who got on his surfboard and went out into the ocean and just happened to catch the big wave, and, and that wave was just a massive collective effort of everyone involved, whether that's, in academia or, even within the provincial government or, with all of our cousins I was talking about in there and, just people that were coming out of the woodworks from, the communities, the villages, the res, coming over on the ferries from the mainland. And that all just seemed to congregate right at the legislature. And that turned into a massive movement of thousands of people. And then, yeah, someone handed me a megaphone and I would just talk and share stories and just try to share the knowledge that I felt was critical for really understanding why what was happening to the Wet'suwet'en people was such an egregious crime. Whether you approach it from the perspective of settler or whether you approach it from the perspective of Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en law, like it was just like universally it was shady. very shady business that was happening. And that's all I was trying to expose. And so I don't know, it's a lot to reminisce on, and I've hardly had the time to even think about that whole era. But just for any of the friends and relatives and the awesome people who were there and part of all that, just thank you, and much appreciation if you're listening. Love you all, and I hope you're doing good, and you're finding those little victories in the day to day, because yeah, you definitely helped lift me up to be in a place where I could be right now, to be supporting my own people and our young people and fighting PRGT. So I'm good.
Wado to you too. I think you've inspired and continue to inspire a lot of us. I remember taking my classes out to the legislature during that time, and even being on the drum. I had the hand drum, and I remember the drumming was so loud that people could hear it inside the legislature. It was just those amazing moments. And so thank you for the inspiring leadership and work that you do and continue to do for the health and well-being of our future generations. So wado for that. I'll shift gears a little bit. And you've made some hilarious videos and on Instagram, just talking about almost showing how absurd some of these pipeline stances are. And so it's kind of a larger question of, what role does humor play in Indigenous movements as you've seen it, especially as a land defender like yourself?
Really, our satirical series basically targeting this paramilitary police group that we were talking about earlier, and that was I don't think it has an official title, but we just call them Gold Commander.
Yeah, Gold Commander, that's right. Yeah.
So that's our body of work. That Saturday is the what we really saw is this very flawed and problematic injunction enforcement and exclusion procedures that were just being put across the board. And so that came out of, I think we were sitting around in the dead of winter, at the second blockade that was happening on the CN rail tracks in New Hazelton on Gitxsan territory. And that was, in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. And I think this was kind of right around the time when Coyote Camp was raided. And, Coastal GasLink was trying to gain access to these drill sites so they could start drilling under the Wet'suwet'en, which is the river for the Wet'suwet'en people. Very high place of cultural significance, but also, one of the critical salmon spawning habitats. And so we were sitting around probably minus 20, minus 25 weather. It's freezing our butts off, like the depression kind of starts to set in when you're, days in on end, just trying to hold a specific space by a highway with big trucks barreling by, and any one of them could slip on ice and crush you at any time, and chain smoking cigarettes, not feeling particularly healthy. But at the same time, we'd just be watching all the communications coming out of the province. And, one trend we identified right off the bat was, the province was denying any and all culpability on how these injunctions were being enforced. Because you had, major movements popping up around this time to really criticize and dissect what SERG was doing, what they were, how they were operating. Like we'd seen the first raids on Wet'suwet'en, we'd seen, I think all the, there was Yellowhead reports, and there was, other bodies being set up to basically, just parse apart who these people were and why they were doing what they're doing, and most importantly, how they were able to get away with it, under the context of Canadian law. And so, after the first raids, we saw, all these terms introduced like, oh yeah, lethal overwatch. Like they were basically authorized to shoot people, in the Wet'suwet'en territories. And, we saw that they had, people lined up to take kids away, from their parents and put them basically into the system. If they were at these places where these raids were happening, we saw, a ton of other like very, almost, like we're used to colonial violence, but it's like someone just took the textbook for colonial violence and tried to follow it to a T when they, put together the marching orders for this community industry response group. But British Columbia denying any and all involvement. We have no say on how, the RCMP and implement their injunctions. Then we'd look at the injunctions, and their injunctions that would have no mention of exclusion zones. They would have no mention of, all these tactics that were being employed. And so then we saw, okay, well, the RCMP seems to have, absolute discretion on how they enforce these injunctions. And then the province is saying they don't oversee the RCMP. And so then, the big discussion became, well, who the hell is directing them? Like if no one wanted to take responsibility. And so then we started to follow different trails like the money. And then we saw that, I think at the time you had Mike Farnsworth, who was, authorizing all these influxes of cash to support SERG operations. And then we started to speculate, okay, what do these conversations, what would they look like behind the scenes? And then at the time, I was mentioning it was all cold and dreary and depressing, and we're how many years into this fight. And then we thought, oh, why don't we just make something funny? Like, rather than just kind of putting this out as some post on Instagram or, doing a write-up, that, maybe a handful of the hardcore people who are really invested in following along will see. Like, let's make a video where I dress up as the leader of the SERG unit who's basically asking Mike Farnsworth for money. And let's like, how would that conversation go within the context of, all these different conversations? We were trying to keep track of all these public statements that were being put out there. And that led to the first Gold Commander, where I also played Mike Farnsworth. And, and my favorite part of that whole conversation is he's wearing that Every Child Matters orange t-shirt, well, basically just giving the thumbs up to like this brutal enforcement on native land. And, it's so if you haven't seen Gold Commander, look for the very first one. It's on Gitxsan Nation Media, which, this is that's something we also realized we could have picked a way simpler name if we wanted to make it easier for people to find our videos.
Absolutely. Check it out. It's hilarious. I love it. I love it.
So just to cap that off, just real quickly, so for us, Gold Commander and the humor, that became like cathartic. Like, like as soon as we heard that like aunties at Unistoten were getting a chuckle out of it and people were starting to look forward to it, and on the front lines they were, quoting all these things like, oh, those Wet'suwet'ens are acting up again, or, like all those little things, even when we were joking about how they mispronunciate all the names and like, how they're wearing Arc'teryx gear and like we were just throwing stuff at the wall. Like, this was just a couple of dudes in front of a green screen, like basically making fun of cops because those cops were roughing us around for a little too long, and so let's get back at them any way we can. And ultimately we're peaceful people, so and that's been the big trend throughout this whole thing. Like we'll stand up and fight and get arrested, whatever, and like heavy machinery, that's not people. We might do stuff to that, but when it comes to people, when it comes to cops, like no one's going to get shot, no one's going to get hurt, like at any of these events. But But one way we can get back at them is through just picking them apart with humor. And it's so we found there was just an appreciation, there was a need at the time for some levity. There was a need just to cheer people up. So we would pull out the camera, pull out the green screen, just do some ridiculous stuff, make fun of the RCMP, what was happening. We'd do a Christmas special where we'd be like feeding them slop from a bucket and with CGL on it to a bunch of pigs in a pig pen and be like, your Christmas bonus just came in. And just stuff like that, like Gold Commander with like that little booklet form of UNDRIP, lighting it on fire and like smoking a cigar with it, and like we we just had fun with it. That was the thing. Like it wasn't some super calculated thing. Like we just needed to have fun because it was getting tough, and then people were getting tired, and we smoked way too many cigarettes. Like, yeah, there was just a lot of stuff that wears on you. And it's so Gold Commander for us was just a release. It was just fun. And we're happy that people seem to enjoy it. And hopefully people learned a thing or two out of it. But even like at a very superficial level, like I think it's still good for a couple of chuckles.
Well, and it's such an important, I guess, aspect of resilience, and preventing burnout, like you were talking about. Like people need to laugh. And remind me, the late Vine Deloria Jr. used to say in Custer Died for Your Sins that humor is an essential part of any Indigenous movement. And I think that was true in 1969, and I think it's true in 2025. It's a key ingredient, and often undervalued, I think, or neglected, but it's key. Yeah, what for that, and we'll get Gold Commander back into the prominent place that it deserves. We're kind of nearing the end, and I just had a couple. Well, this is a big question, but getting to some of the larger questions of when thinking about the collision of past, present, and future. What does Indigenous liberation at the end of the day look like for you?
So, yeah, for myself, I think that's the key question because that's the long-term strategy. We go back to the beginning of this conversation. Like I think at least I identified, within my perspective, colonialism at an international level is the strategy that's being employed that we're going up against. But for us, we need the antithesis to that. And, that's not just going to be one fight here or there. Like, a pipeline, that'll be maybe a decade. But then, you got to look at, okay, well, what else is a part of that pipeline? Who are the major players behind it? What are their motives? And then for us, we can't always just be in the frame of mind of counterattacking. Like, we need to be ready because, I think we can expect the pipeline's not going to be the last thing. Even already with Coastal GasLink, we saw as soon as they opened up these right-of-ways into huge swaths of land, especially ones that were, previously untouched. When you kind of go along the Clore River and get to the borders of the Haisla territories there, we saw that, those right-of-ways will branch out and those will become cut blocks and those will become, mineral tenures and those will become all sorts of things. And, especially those right-of-ways can become more pipelines and those can become more critical energy infrastructure. And that could be for gas, it could be for bitumen. And so, for us, the pipeline is only a symptom of the deeper underlying issues. And, given the global trajectory right now, gas, oil and gas has a very limited lifespan. it might seem like a long time within our span of, the span of our lives, but realistically, when you're looking at like a macro scale, that stuff's going to run out relatively quick. And what can we anticipate from that? Well, seeing that everyone's just doubling down with draining the reserves that are left on the planet, we're guessing that, there's kind of going to be a crisis transition to, battery electric infrastructure. And, what do you need for that? Well, you need mining, like in mining on a scale that we've never seen in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Like, especially if you want to keep up the status quo of, okay, I need a new car every couple of years, I need new this every couple of years. Like, I think unless we move out of that consumer mindset, we're going to need so many mines that it's going to make our head spin. And where are a lot of these mines proposed to be located? Well, that's the vast traditional territories of the indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And for us, like, yeah, I think we have a lot of gold, we have a lot of lithium, we have a lot of, antimony, we have a lot of like what would be classified as critical resources or critical minerals at the national scale on Gitxsan territory, on Wet'suwet'en territory, like in the north, like on Tahltan territory, across the board. So, for us, it feels like, we're just looking at the first domino in a whole series of dominoes. And, unless we get our foundation solid, we're going to be just gasping in shock each time those dominoes fall. But I think realistically, at this point, we could look back and see what led up to all this. We could look at, the permitting, we could look at like the Environmental Assessment Office, the supposed regulatory bodies, and see how those all played their part. And I think we can get proactive in fighting those, and specifically from an inherent rights standpoint. And, so Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en, we have a very unique position when it comes because of the Delgamuukw court case. But that position has not changed in the last 30 years. And I think there's a lot that we can do to build up upon that rather than basically meeting the province halfway, which has been happening. And so for all the Gitxsan people of my generation, it's well, we need to pinpoint all their weaknesses right now, and we need to target those. And then we also need to start working with Indigenous people around the world and start pooling our resources and energy into finding strategic victories. And and all basically with this frame of mind that we're all fighting to one day get to that point where we can be independent again. Because we've all lived our entire lives basically being told that either that your people are lesser than or you're incapable of. And in my opinion, there's no reason that Gitxsan people wouldn't be able to sustain and operate an independent Gitxsan state on the national scale.
Yeah.
Like fundamentally, there's nothing that inhibits us from doing so, except what I would say is like, the colonial strategy, the colonial rhetoric that basically, tries to frame our peoples as, being politically dysfunctional and disjointed and, infighting and this and that. But that always stems, like if you look back at it, that stems from these strategic injections of money, these strategic projects that get dropped on us, like just that get dropped on us. And so then I think we can start to pick apart their strategy, but we need our own long-term strategy. And that long-term strategy has to cover all the basics, and that's food, that's water, that's housing, that's, all the creature comforts. It's the basic human rights that, are very entrenched within our culture. And so that's where, my mind's been at, like the pipeline, that's something like we're going to kill it, but at the same time, that's just one of the dominoes. And, I think in the long term, like what I really do want to see is Gitxsan independence. And I think for that to happen, we really need to be strategic about it. We need to see where the crown is monopolized, like the core functions of, our livelihoods, as well as, when you're looking at, especially things like food and water and housing, like those are critical. How does the crown maintain control over these areas? And then we need to build up, our own independent, sustainable infrastructure to basically demonopolize, the this crown stranglehold over our lives. And I think, as the more we can do that, the less, we'll be bound by, like we need the crown's money and the crown's jobs in order just to live. And then I think as soon as you start to eliminate all these equations, then it makes it very difficult for the crown just to come in and arbitrarily and with their loosey-goosey rules and procedures, force all these projects to happen, or even to find the people within the Gitxsan Nation or Wet'suwet'en Nation or whatever nation who'd be willing to go along with that. And so, I think that resilience is fundamental. It can't just happen. I think similar to, how you described to our classroom many years ago, the everyday acts of resurgence, like it's got to happen all the time, not just at flashpoints. It's, I think it's that, it's that act of nation building at every level. Not, I don't even want to say nation building necessarily because, I think for us as Gitxsan, even our youth movement that's popped up right now in response to this pipeline, but also is working on those long-term strategies of Gitxsan independence and while mitigating what we anticipate to be the next dozen round of projects that'll come to our land. But, for us, that includes, all the non-Gitxsan youth who live on our lands. That includes everyone. Like there's basic human rights. Like our human rights isn't just only for Gitxsan people, but it's starting to move within to that mindset or into that mindset of independence, of, what is citizenship, what are human rights, what, protections are people afforded, and how can we do this in a way that is more appealing than what the crown currently gives us, either through the welfare system or, what have you. And, how can you make it more appealing that having salmon that'll, supply you with protein year over year over year so that your family will never starve, is better than having a pipeline that'll, maybe give you 3 years worth of employment income. It's so like those are the discussions. And I think just to me, I found it's always just a very helpful mental exercise just to imagine what that is like, as if the crown just poof disappeared, kind of like in Smoke Signals, the scene with the basketball, poof, Ottawa. But yeah, so I mean that's the long-term thing that I think, like myself, and I know lots of Indigenous people, like we're going to be thinking about that our entire lives because this goes beyond just our generation. Like I'm pretty sure that whatever plans or machinations that we put forward, we may not see the fruits of it in our lifetimes, but like I think, just in the long term, like for the health and the dignity of our people, I think that's a worthy goal to work towards, that independence, that liberation, and that especially if we all work together, we find the weaknesses in colonialism across the world. We pool in, we tackle those one by one, we set the precedents, and at the same time, we build up our own infrastructure to be sustainable. I think, to me, that's the strategy, rather than, just all coming together every once in a while and, throwing our money into these fights that, like they're important, but at the end of the day, like they'll simmer down. But I think, if we could build up that infrastructure that rivals or that is capable of competing with, what we're fighting against these people on Wall Street, these people in the legislatures, these people who basically command like a heck of a lot of monetary resources. But, we've got the people resources, we've got the spirit resources. And I think, there's a lot of planning we can do to get those victories, to, make silly videos, to do all the things that make it sustainable in the long run. So that's my short answer.
Wado for that and for sharing such a powerful vision. I like that word demonopolize too. That's a great way of looking at it. So last question, is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to discuss? And I'll kind of combine it with the other question. Are there some things that are happening in your territory or in the region that we should be watching for or paying attention to that aren't necessarily showing up in our news cycles?
So yeah, I think I'll just do a plug for all my relatives who are out there, on the Lafayette. We're basically holding space on the right of ways right now as we speak. And, I think the big one that like I do want to mention is Teresa Brown, who's from the House of Gitxsan, and she built a dog sanctuary right on the right of way. Um, I think way out in the bush, and already like there's just so many dogs that have been headed her way, and I think that was an interesting one because we're basically supporting all our Gitxsan relatives who are fighting for their for their land, to protect their Lafayette, to protect their cultural duties to said Lafayette. And Teresa wanted to do it while also helping dogs, especially dogs that didn't have a home or didn't have a place, or the proverbial res dogs, so to speak. And like there's barely shelter space up here, and all the shelters that we have are basically kill shelters. And so it's a rough life if you're a dog and you end up in a situation where you're out of your home, or your homeowner ends up dealing with cancer in Vancouver or what have you. Like, so Teresa set this up. She's already got like a dozen puppies up there, and all these adult dogs, and she's taking care of them all, and meanwhile protecting her land and fighting a pipeline. And yeah, and there's cabins going up, there's kennels, it's all off grid, wood fueled, like a big operation. And people supporting and chipping in has helped big time, like with doggy chow. I've done some supply runs for them. I'll go into the animal feed store in Smithers and walk out with $2,000 worth of dog food at a time. And people make it possible just with donating to help out that initiative. And the best part is too, I often joke about the optics of using puppies to stop a pipeline. It's like, people might not care about native rights, but puppies.
It's it's true. Sadly, it's true.
And then it almost makes them sound like a villain in a Disney movie when, imagine you're the CEO who's trying to put a pipeline through a dog sanctuary.
I love it. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And is there I'm sure there's a website where people can tap into to make donations or, support that? Yeah.
Right now it's so on Instagram, I think just to get the updates on all the different fronts and to figure out how to support them, because you also have Maddie Lee, you also have the Gitnyao, who have like done amazing work to completely slow down the construction activities that were proposed near their territories. And then you also have Gitxsan houses like the House of Gukunooks and amazing folks like Ardith Wilson, who's one of their chiefs, Dimdi Gabu. And so I think to get updates on all these folks and to figure out how to support the dog sanctuary, like I would either recommend following at Get Loose from Hetwit. I'll share all these links because they're a lot to write down. At Gitxsan Land or something, but we went with using our language.
I like it. I like it. I think it needs to happen. Yeah.
No, people will adapt. So at Get Loot from Hetwit on Instagram, and then we also have my personal Instagram, which has basically become just something for sharing movement related stuff, which is at K Sutherland-Wilson. Then we also have at Lachip Youth, which is the official page for the youth movement. And then I think there's also at Gitnyao Chiefs, I believe. We can always double check that one, but I'll send the correct one. But for all the donations, like, we just use landbackcc@gmail.com. Like PayPal or e-transfer, and all that money right now just goes towards the doggy sanctuary. And, building up that infrastructure, building cabins. We're building a hemp creek cabin out there right now that my brother is taking the lead on, and it's quite something, like, using innovative, sustainable materials. So we're not bringing out basically just stuff that'll end up a mushy pile of fiberglass or plastic on the land in how many years, but just trying to think long term. And so, and I mean, like, land defense is full spectrum. It's, right now at this point, it's getting vaccinations for puppies to, building sustainable housing to, also gardening, and then blocking critical infrastructure, and then also mobilizing people and, dealing with like, all the social stuff, but also, especially at that internal community level, having all those conversations. And that's what the Lachip youth, the youth for the Gitxsan Lachip of the Gitxsan Lachip, have been doing amazing work of. And so there's a lot of players right now doing a lot of awesome work. And hopefully some of those links will kind of help you to keep track.
That's great. Wado, thank you so much for taking your time out today to speak with us, and I look forward to future conversations. So, Wado, thank you, Colin.
Thanks for having me.